Okay, our next speaker is David Whetham, and he will talk about remote killing and the remoteness of wind.
Thank you very much. I see we've lost the youngest member of our audience now.
She said that.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to talk about drones. They've been mentioned a few times, but it's pretty clear that they're a ubiquitous part of the battle space now. As of 2013, the US Army, not the US military, the US Army alone had more than 7,500 unmanned aerial systems. That was up from 76 in 2002. Even the UK has a modest squadron or two of Reapers armed with Hellfire missiles. However, the technology is certainly not restricted to the US and her allies. Indeed, it's very clear that Iran, even Hezbollah, have drone capabilities. The numbers are increasing. It's difficult not to conclude that they're going to be an integral part of most future military operations. The debate is extremely polarized, but as with most complex issues, often it's not clear what it is that people are actually objecting to. What most people seem to object to about the use of drones is the practice of targeted killing, particularly into sovereign territory of somebody else's country. Targeted killing is not something I'm going to talk about today. Targeted killing is not a drone-specific concern. You can carry out targeted killing using a missile, a sniper, a special forces wet team behind enemy lines. Targeted killing it carries with it a whole bunch of other moral baggage, which I'm not going to engage with now. But I'm going to briefly touch on the other issues that come up with drones. So the idea of the fear of killer machines, the perceived unfairness of the use of that type of tool, the allegedly indiscriminate nature of drones, the excessive civilian casualties. I'm going to look at each of those issues briefly, hopefully in a slightly more balanced rather than hysterical way. But I want specifically lead on to looking at issues about fighting from afar and what this does, what this might mean for our concept of victory. Quick caveat, drones can be used for all sorts of things, from anti-poaching operations through to monitoring forest fires, but I'm specifically talking about military drones used to kill people. So let's start with autonomous killing. So autonomous killer robots, Terminator, flying Terminators. So this is the idea that drones are cold, calculating, emotionless machines dispatched to eliminate any and all identifiable threats. Responding to this particular fear, the Ministry of Defence in the United Kingdom no longer uses the term drone. In fact, I'd get a slap on the wrist for even using that term at the moment. In the UK, military personnel are only allowed to refer to them as remotely piloted air systems now, RPAS. In one sense, that's far more accurate because it emphasises the fact that although elements of their use are automated, such as taking off and landing, there is a person in the loop. There is always a person in the loop when life and death decisions are made, and so the rebranding, if you like, in the UK is to try and address this. They haven't done anything else; they've just given it a new name, and that's apparently good enough. Despite many ambitious claims to the contrary, no system yet exists that can discriminate between a combatant and a non-combatant in a war zone, or conflict zone. As such, the UK position remains very clear. A fully autonomous system would have to have the capability of making the qualitative assessments currently required by the law of armed conflict, and until this is possible, the human must remain clearly within the decision-making process. So autonomous killing is simply not an issue at this stage. However, we also have to accept that basically it's only a matter of time before this does become the norm. Human out-of-the-loop systems are being developed at the moment. And of course, this raises a number of questions about responsibility and accountability that are quite profound and quite huge. Leading to the campaign to stop killer robots at the moment, and the UN campaign to stop this technology from being actually applied in the war zone. But as I say again, at the moment this is not the case. What about killing at a distance? Well, standoff weapons are nothing new. A rock thrown is a standoff weapon. A Tomahawk cruise missile is a standoff weapon. There's a difference between the two, but they're both standoff weapons. A soldier with a sniper rifle looking through a scope from a distance of several kilometers is using a standoff weapon. Now, okay, a drone pilot's degree of remoteness is somewhat different by a factor of several thousand miles, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any moral difference between the soldier looking down the rifle scope and the pilot using an aircraft's heads-up display to target a laser-guided bomb and a drone operator looking at targets on a screen. One of the obvious physical differences is that even the pilot in the fast jet is over, or at least near, the theatre of military operations. So there are risks that the drone operator is simply not concerned with, unless he's worried about the drive to work. Should this matter? Should this matter? Some of our colleagues think absolutely this should matter, but this is a good thing, not a bad thing. It would appear perverse to insist on putting one's own personnel in harm's way if you can achieve the same effect without doing so. So this line of argument has led B.J. Strawser, for example, to argue that there is a moral imperative to use more drones, not less. If you can achieve the same effect without putting people in harm's way, that is the means that you should be choosing. They are morally preferable. But others fear that there is a risk of moral disconnection. A moral disconnection that, so the argument being it's easy to see how some people might say they're just pixels on a screen. I'm only moving dots around on a monitor. You don't have to look anybody in the eye. Therefore, this is a clear, perhaps even extreme example of dehumanization. It also raises questions about how much easier it really is for the person to pull the trigger if they're 8,000 kilometers away to begin with. A.C. Grayling, the philosopher, notes that a World War II bomber crew could release bombs that would kill hundreds, possibly thousands of women and children, but if you gave them a knife and showed them into the room where those women and children were standing there and asked them to go one by one and slit the throat of each of those non-combatants, hopefully very few of them would have been able to do that. Physical separation makes terrible things possible, even if you are, in an abstract sense, aware of what it is that you're doing. So given this lack of physical contact associated with remote killing, it's easy to assume that lines can become blurred and even civilians can come to be just seen as another target. However, physical distance does not always guarantee a corresponding emotional separation. This is also clear. Perhaps surprisingly, just as fast jet pilots can suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, so can drone pilots. There's a huge number of cases coming out now where drone pilots who've never personally even been in or over the theatre of military operations are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And this has led some people to wonder whether their experience might actually be closer to that of a military sniper rather than a remote operator. And the reason being that a military sniper can be intimately aware of the target that they're going to be engaging. You might be watching for several days. You know their pattern of life. You can look over their shoulder while they read the newspaper. You see them kissing little Johnny before he goes off to work. You become intimately aware of the person that you are going to kill. Just as a sniper a sniper does this, so does a drone operator. A pattern of life is built up, and using real-time video feeds long before any decision is actually made to strike in some circumstances. Plus, the other thing that is often overlooked is that if you call in an artillery strike, the person who delivers the artillery strike, generally speaking, isn't aware of what the results of that artillery strike will be, whereas a drone operator, part of the job is to do a battle damage assessment afterwards. Versus several hours afterwards, the drone operator who has released the munition is intimately aware of what they have done. They will see the family turning up, they will see the parts of charred body being picked up, they will see the funeral procession gathering, they will see all of this while being perfectly aware that they caused this. So such considerations feed into a wider debate regarding the long-term emotional effects and supports required for drone operators. And it will be interesting to see if post-traumatic stress disorder becomes a significant issue in the drone operator community. The separation from risk, on the other hand, can actually, the argument is that it's not necessarily a bad thing anyway. If you're not directly at risk on a mission, this can provide you with certain advantages. You're not the one in harm's way. You are not the one who is having to make a life or death situation instantly. So there is an opportunity to step back and have what in the UK, due to an advert campaign, is known as the Hamlet Moment, where you light the cigar and you just think about things a little before delivering lethal force. You can have the opportunity to double check, make sure that you really have got everything that you need to know lined up. So this ability to remain cool, calm and detached arguably allows better decisions rather than worse decisions that otherwise might be taken in the heat of battle. So what about situational awareness? Some people say, well, there's a 2-second time delay if you're in a drone. You can only see a tiny part of the battlefield. You're only aware of what your camera is showing you. I've spoken to a lot of RPAS operators who are also fast jet pilots, and their argument is that actually it comes down to the chosen field of view. You have just as restricted view from the cockpit of the fast jet as you do from a drone booth, if that's the view that you choose to take, or you can widen it, you can narrow it, and in both cases you are at liberty to request additional feeds. You can get additional feeds from other sources, whether you're in a fast jet, and it's actually much easier if you're in a drone operating booth. You can get visual backup from other sources to make sure that your information is as accurate as possible. And there's other advantages to being physically remote as well. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the Mental Health Advisory Team reports from 2006, which demonstrated that those who had recently faced combat losses amongst their group of comrades were far more likely to have higher anger, unsurprisingly, in combat, and were far more likely to therefore mistreat both enemy combatants and non-combatants. There's plenty of empirical evidence to back that up. And as such, the enforced attachment to the drone operator might well be an extremely positive thing. So what about the removal of physical risk? Does this interestingly raises some questions with regards to giving out medals. Are they really at war at all? Are they actually at war? Are they warriors? I think this is part of challenging, possibly changing our ideas of what war looks like. If you go into work and it's simply another day at the office, it's just that you're delivering lethal force while there, and then you drive home again, call in at the 7-Eleven on the way back, pick up a bottle of wine. On the way to work the following day, you do the school run. On the way to deliver lethal force on behalf of your political community. What does this do to our picture of what war actually is? It also can raise some interesting questions, some interesting challenges. I'll just ask a question which I assume is going to be fairly straightforward. If somebody's planting an improvised explosive device, an IED, somebody planting an IED, are they liable to lethal force? Are they liable to lethal force? Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think that's particularly contentious. You are liable to lethal force if you are planting an improvised explosive device, intending to hurt people. What about if you're giving a lift, knowingly, for somebody who will be planting an improvised explosive device? Do you become liable to harm? Okay, certain UK military lawyers have question marks over that, but even they concede that you're in a vehicle which is on a mission to deliver an improvised explosive device. The vehicle is certainly targetable, as is the person who is planting the device. There is no doubt that this vehicle is perfectly legitimately targetable under the law of armed conflict and under most interpretations of self-defense. Okay. What about the drone operator wife whose car is in the garage, so is given a lift by her husband to work on the way on the school run? Is that car a legitimate object of military activity? If you said yes to the previous two examples, how on earth does it matter whether you're in Nevada or Afghanistan? It doesn't. So what does this do to the way that we conceive of the battle space? If we are choosing to fight wars from 6,000 miles away, what does that do to the way that we conceive of war? And I don't think we've really thought through some of those implications. In the UK, we're just starting to, as the drone operators are moving back to the UK now. All right, what about accountability? If you call in fire support and it's delivered from a drone, it's not like you can just catch the name badge in the corridor of the person who's delivered it. So what happens if something goes wrong? How can individual responsibility be determined? Well, I completely accept that a lot of this is down to the way technology is used. It can be abused, just as any other technology is. But certainly from the Afghanistan theatre, the robust command and control procedures there are comparable to every other weapon system. It's exactly the same. It's the same kill chain. It's exactly the same process. There is no difference in the way that lethal force is applied. It's the same process, the same accountability process. There are some interesting debates in theatre as to who owns the bomb, the UK interpretation versus the US interpretation, for example. But there's still no doubt that it's a highly accountable. Somebody is very clearly responsible at all times. And actually, in many ways, the very nature of the new technology offers a much higher degree of oversight than virtually any other area of military activity. I mean, every movement of the joystick, every frame of camera footage, therefore every decision is captured and recorded. You can't hide from a bad decision. If there is a will to do so, then it is certainly very easy to find out where a mistake has happened. And as we're finding out now, if they choose not to investigate, then WikiLeaks will probably find out anyway. There's also a question of accountability that goes further than this, than simply the operator. And that's, although it's an unpalatable term, the use to spy on friendly forces as well. It's not just hostile forces that drones can be used upon. So if there's at least a chance of misdemeanors being captured on film or even being watched live, knowing or even thinking that there's a small chance of someone actually looking over your shoulder may improve behaviour and accountability among a much wider community than simply the drone operators. All right, what about precision? It's paradox. This idea, the paradox of precision. This idea that actually drones are an indiscriminate weapon system that are responsible for more deaths than any other weapon system currently being deployed. I think it's useful to start off with a historical contrast. Second World War, on average, it took 108 planes to prosecute a single target using saturation bombing. 108 planes. Today, you can achieve the same result using one platform with nobody in it at all. You can destroy the same target with a unparalleled accuracy, vastly minimizing any collateral damage, normally to zero. The resulting collateral damage compared to the same mission as it would have been practiced 60 years ago is obviously extraordinarily different, and it's therefore very, very significant. But it's also, of course, it's a win-win from both sides. Less pilots. You haven't got 108 bomber crews, 6 people in each bomber. You haven't got any pilots at all at risk, and you've got far fewer people at risk on the ground. So it's a win-win. Plus, financially, it's efficient into the bargain. Everybody wins. However, some things, obviously, do go wrong. Any decision's only as good as the information or assumptions that go into it. And whether through mistake or bad staff work, accidents can clearly happen. And using drones or other supposedly accurate standoff systems can lead to this idea of this paradox of precision. And this is the assumption that because the weapon system is in theory incredibly accurate, whatever it is that you hit must be what you meant to hit. And this is far more of a problem than the actual real accuracy of the weapon. It's about managing expectations and making it clear that this new technology hasn't eliminated the fog of war. It hasn't eliminated friction. And pretending it has only does us a disservice. What about perceptions of legitimacy, asymmetry? The moral asymmetry normally focuses on the use of things like the previously mentioned IEDs or guerrilla or terrorist attacks. But the deployment of drones arguably reverses this asymmetry. Any activity carried out by a technologically sophisticated protagonist against a less sophisticated one is inherently asymmetric. And some people argue that this means that war effectively has lost its classical dual nature, and it's approached some form of pest control, perhaps. It's like playing God from afar, just using unmanned weapons substituted for lightning bolts. Disturbing those images though they are, I think there's something fundamentally misguided by the argument that you're only supposed to use the same technology that your opponent has access to. So the idea, for example, that because they can only use dumb bombs, you're only supposed to use dumb bombs. You shouldn't use a more sophisticated targeting process. Because they're only using conscripts, you should only use reservists or something. It just doesn't make sense. If we were to, I think it would be morally perverse, in fact, I'll go further, to use less accurate weapons out of some attempt to make things fairer. That's not what the point of proportionality is about. It's related to proportionality of the injury suffered, not proportionality as to what your opponent is capable of doing back to you. And it's interesting that all of the arguments made against the use of drones by the US along and across the Pakistan border about how unfair, and in Afghanistan, about how unfair this is. None of those arguments were made when drones were being used over Libya to protect the civilian population. Didn't hear any of those arguments. Drones didn't seem to be such a problem when they were being used in that purpose. So I think this goes back to my first point. People are confused about what it is they're arguing against often. Presumably it wouldn't be unfair to monitor a ceasefire or prevent a genocide from the air using a tool that your opponents can't counter, for example. Okay, what about the threshold to the use of military force? Precision strike from standoff weapon systems seem to offer policymakers an option for direct action that would simply not be possible using more conventional tools. And this is getting directly to this idea of victory now. So, are we entering a period of drive-by wars, as Ignatieff has coined it? Is it becoming easier, perhaps too easy, to get into wars? Do the new options basically provide policymakers with a first resort rather than a last resort tool? First of all, it's worth noting, I'm not necessarily sure that this is a bad thing. I would have loved to have seen drones deployed over Syria, monitoring, not necessarily armed drones, but monitoring, or over Darfur. On the other hand, an ability to kill, but with little or no willingness to die, could give the impression that we have no stomach for the real fight, that the cowards fighting from afar. So what does this do? What does this actually do to the nature of the duel, as Clausewitz would call it? Does this create a perception that we're not actually willing to fight? That we're willing to, we're unwilling to fight, therefore you just have to kill a few of whoever you can kill, and we'll all go home? And what about the further unintended consequence? If it's impossible, if you have deliberately made it impossible to strike your own military's assets through a process of using remote warfare, does that legitimize attacks on your own civilian population as a consequence, if that is the only thing that can be struck in response? I don't think it does, but I can see how that argument would be very persuasive to a group of people who are otherwise utterly powerless by what they're being faced with. I can see how those arguments could become quite compelling. So to try and tie this together, very clearly drones can be seen as a continued evolution of manned air power that started 100 years ago with the conflict at the anniversary of which we're here for. As with any other military technology, it's open to abuse and misuse. It would be churlish not to acknowledge that there are considerable moral advantages in many respects to what drones can bring to the military battle space. And many of those are to be genuinely welcomed from an ethical perspective. However, there are a number of challenges that potentially come to a head if drones go from being part of a military toolbox to becoming the predominant military tool. And I've touched on a number of those, but I think, in a nutshell, I think there is a risk that the feeling of impunity that remote killing offers might make it easier to become involved in conflicts that prudence would otherwise mean that we would not get involved with. And at the same time, it might also make those conflicts more difficult to resolve due to a demonstrable lack of will to actually go through what is required to put people in harm's way when required. Clausewitz makes it clear that it is possible to win without shedding blood. You can win without shedding blood, but you have to be willing to shed blood to do that. And your opponent has to believe that you're willing to shed more blood than they are willing to shed to be able to do that, to make your actions credible. So I think there's a very real concern that we may end up getting into conflicts easier and at the same time relying on tools that simply demonstrate we're not willing to pay the price that victory requires to end those conflicts.